Welcome everybody to our recorded Zoom meeting. This is Mary Schlueter here. Let me just make sure that we've got everything here that I need. I think we're pretty good. All right. So I'm going to walk you through tonight the way that this will be our first Zoom meeting. We might have a few bugs in it. It's okay. We'll work them out. You know, technology is great when it works, and hopefully it'll be working tonight. I'm kind of experimenting between doing these live online or recording them so that we'll just meet kind of as a, office hours meeting first, and then you will go and watch the recorded lecture, or maybe we'll do it all live. I'm not sure yet. So we'll see what works best. I look forward to your feedback and seeing how these things are working. So anyway, the first thing I'd like to do is to go over a little bit of housekeeping with you guys. First of all, great job on that first discussion. I thought your questions were good. I could tell that you had accessed the course content either through the textbook or through the videos, and that was good. Please be sure to maintain those deadlines. The postings have to be done by Thursday at midnight, the first initial post, and then 3 responses are due by Sunday at midnight. I can only give partial credit for anything that comes in late. People typically don't go back and look at the discussions afterwards, and I want to make sure that especially because this is an online class, but also because I want you to be accessing the content and learning. But the collaboration is so important in an online class through the discussion board. So please just pay attention to those deadlines. A reminder that your observation teacher bios are due. That's just that email that you're sending to your teacher telling them a little bit about yourself. Please email me, just CC me on those emails so that I can give you credit for that. I'd like those as soon as possible. I know a lot of you have already done that. As far as your observations go, I'm going to switch into this next slide for just a minute. Just so that you understand, there's 20 hours total. Up to 5 hours can be with English language learners, high ability learners, sometimes called gifted and talented. That's kind of an old term though. Usually it's HAL, H-A-L. Maybe your school is using a different term. Those things change from time to time. But anyway, up to 5 hours of the 15 can be that. Once you get to start going to your placements, and I'm sure some of you already have, if you are in a self-contained classroom, a classroom where the kids stay in a classroom with just other students in special ed, they're not mainstreamed out into the regular classroom setting with general ed student population, I would like you to please ask your cooperating teacher if there was some way that you could get at least 5 hours or even 1 hour, just something where you are observing kids in the regular classroom setting, because most of you are going to be general education teachers. You are not going to be working in these self-contained classrooms. And so if you could see what that looks like in the regular classroom, that would be good. Make sure that if you are in some of your placements, you will be, just because of where you are, you will be going into some co-taught classrooms. So that will be there anyway. Those are conversations to have with your cooperating teacher. If they can't do it, they can't do it, and that's fine. Just we'll do the best that we can. It still is valuable, even if you do spend your whole observation time in a self-contained classroom, because you will get to see the nature of different disabilities, assistive technologies that are used with these kids, the different other professionals that work with them, and so on. So if you can get at least 5 hours in an inclusion setting, that would be good. These are kids with IEPs being taught in the regular classroom. If you do go in and observe in the regular classroom setting, please ask the teacher ahead of time which students have IEPs. That might be a little bit helpful. And let's see. If possible, ask to see a co-taught classroom or a classroom with a specialist in it. Specialists include things like speech pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, or even a paraprofessional. So that's ideal. We are their guests in their school. So if you can't get that, you can't get that, and that's okay. Just whatever, that's fine. Let's see what else. I just wanted to point out to you that in Moodle, please make sure that you're paying close attention to these, the schedule and assignment due dates. It is expected that before you come to class, whether it's a Zoom class or whether it's a discussion board, that you have read, looked through the textbook, and watched all the videos. And in here, you'll see, once it loads. So for example, on the 19th, which is today. Wait, I guess that's not it. On the 21st, which is today. Chapter 1 is what we're going to be talking about. You should have looked at it ahead of time. It tells you about the teacher bio letter. Last week you read the first half of Chapter 1. Today it is expected that you've read the second half of Chapter 1, and so on. And so if you go through this document, you'll see everything that's due and so on. So this is a pretty important document. I know I pointed out last week, but I really threw a lot of information at you, so you may have forgotten about that. Also, just a reminder that I do have it in calendar form if you prefer that, but the details are there. I know this is an online class, but we have to stick to those deadlines pretty closely. This is not the kind of online class where everything can be due at the end. The points will be taken off for late work. Obviously, if you have some kind of special circumstance, just let me know. And I mean, I'm happy to work with anybody, but we do stick very closely to these guidelines and deadlines, because otherwise I have found that students really struggle. They'll put it off. I know that I would. And by the end, it's too much work to be able to get done. So just pay attention to those things. Those are there for you. And if you ever have questions, please give me a call, text, email. I'm available. I'm here for you. And don't hesitate to ask. And we talked about that. All right, so we'll get into our content for tonight. This mini lecture, there will be 2 activities. Oh, I do want to point out one more thing. There is a document, and there will, I think, probably always be a document that goes with these Zoom classes. So if you will scroll down, I sent it out in the email as well that I send before each Zoom meeting. But if you go under course resources to Zoom meeting information, and then you click open this folder. This makes me download it. I don't know why it does it that way, but it does. It's the link to this document is also in the email that I sent out. But you'll want to have this document handy for our Zoom meeting, because the activities and the links and things that we'll need are in there. So if you don't have that up, please go in and open that now. And like I said, you can also access this link. I will always put it in the email with the Zoom link each week as well. So we'll be referencing that for the next hour or so, or however long this goes on for. All right. So this is a picture of me, not just because I want to be reminded that I was young once, but it does remind me that this is when I was your age. I was a junior or senior in college. I can't remember which year exactly. And I remember that, you know, when I was sitting in your seat, there was so much that I didn't know about schools, and, you know, it was a lot of book learning and some practicum and so on, but there were just a lot of things I was unaware of. One thing I was unaware of was how the teaching profession was going to change over time, both in general education, but especially in special education. And in my junior or senior year, whichever one it was, can't remember exactly, in college, one day I remember my professors came running in. They were super excited, and they said, "We just passed Public Law 94-142." And they were just incredibly, you know, passionate about this and really joyful. And I didn't really know what it meant. What they said was something to the effect of, this is going to break down barriers for our kids with disabilities. They're going to have access now to the regular public schools, and this is such a good thing, and it's going to just be a game changer. And you guys are the young new special ed teachers going out into the world, and it's just so exciting, the changes that it's going to make. And, you know, I just kind of thought, okay, I guess if you say it's a good thing, it's a good thing. But I did not understand what that meant. And it meant that we were going to be switching dramatically the way that we delivered services to students in special education. When I did my student teaching back in 1980, my area of concentration was physical handicaps. And what that meant was that if you had a mild physical handicap, you were, for example, let's say that you had, cerebral palsy and you walked with a limp, very mild. You were put on a bus and bussed out of your neighborhood and sent to a special school across town. This was in Buffalo, New York in 1979. If you had a mild learning disability, you were sent to the school, separate school, segregated school, where all the kids with learning disabilities were sent. If you had a behavior disorder, you were sent to yet another school. So when I did my student teaching, one of them, I had to do a few because my degrees are in regular elementary education and special education. I have dual certification, so I had to do a few of them. But when I did my special education student teaching, I had to go to a school that was segregated just with kids with physical disabilities. And many of those kids had very mild physical disabilities. They had cognitively absolutely average to above average intelligence, but they were in not only segregated classrooms, but segregated schools. Well, what Public Law 94-142 did was it totally overturned that. And immediately, just about overnight, the year after I student taught, all those special schools were closed. They just closed them right away. And then they took all those teachers, the ones that didn't quit, because they were passionate and they loved their kids, but they were worried that it was not the best thing for students with special needs to be put in the regular classroom setting. And so some of those teachers just quit. But teachers like me, I was brand new, so I just said, just tell me where to go and what to do, and I'll do it, because I didn't really know any better. And I ended up in the regular classroom. All these kids were put into their regular neighborhood schools. And that was quite a journey. At first, the general education teachers that first year, I remember the first day, a teacher came up to me and she said, I don't know why you're here. These kids don't belong in here. We don't know how to teach them, and it's not going to be good for them, and it's not going to be good for the other kids. And I remember thinking, well, all righty then, welcome. Thanks for the welcome. But it wasn't that they didn't love our kids or want our kids. It was because they were terrified. They had no training. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have to take a course like this one that all general education teachers are required to take. And it was just a real different landscape. And I remember that first year, I was just trying to get my kids mainstream, that's what we called it, into the regular classroom for physical education, PE, art, and music. And I'll tell you what, a lot of times I was told no. A lot of times I had to beg, bribe, whatever it took to get my kids to even be in one regular classroom. And then they would spend the rest of the day with me in a self-contained setting. And these were kids that had maybe a mild learning disability, a mild physical disability, maybe a high-functioning autism, or a mild behavior disorder that really could have been accommodated in the regular classroom setting, but we just didn't do that yet. So anyway, that was what it used to be. And then it changed to where now we have where kids are in these inclusive classroom settings, and that's what you're going to be seeing. So we have changed dramatically over the course of my career, and this is my 26th year teaching. We have changed dramatically the way that we deliver these special education services. The research shows that it's better for kids socially, emotionally, academically to be in with their regular peers in the classroom, but it has required a lot of adjustments on our part, and you're going to be learning about all those adjustments throughout the course of this career as you learn ways that you as a general education teacher are responsible for accommodating these kids. As difficult as it can be, because you're going to have to differentiate instruction, you have to learn about different disabilities. As we talked last week, you will have these kids in your classroom. I will say that the new way is still better than the old way. So what was the old way? Let's say a child came to kindergarten and they were behind. They went through the kindergarten roundup screening process, and you could tell that they were behind. The way that we used to do it was we'd say, well, they are probably just a little bit developmentally immature. We're just going to wait and see. And so they didn't receive any extra, not only special education services or verification, but they didn't really receive differentiated instruction from the regular classroom teacher. They didn't receive really any kinds of supports. It was all the kids were thrown in. They all got the same instruction. And at the end of kindergarten, the gap was even wider between the achievement of those kids, the ones who were struggling, and their typical peers that did not have those same struggles. So then they would go on to first grade, and they might be on a list, like kind of a watch list, but it was just that, a watch list. They received the same instruction as everyone else. Perhaps they were put in a lower reading group. That was about the only differentiation that I remembered. They might have 3 different reading groups and they would be in the lowest group, but that was about it. By the end of first grade, they were still experiencing a cycle of failure, and there would be talks and meetings about possibly getting them tested, but then they would send them on to second grade. during second grade, they would get on a list to be tested by the school psychologist to see if they had a learning disability or some other kind of disability, to see if they would qualify for services. And that would take a long time, observations, data collecting, extensive testing by the school psychologist. Then a big report would be written up, and then there would be a meeting. Typically, all that would happen at the very end of second grade. And then by the beginning of third grade, if they had received an IEP, and not all kids do. I know of kids who were denied an IEP based on 1 point of an IQ score. And we're going to get into what that means as far as verifying students with learning disabilities in future classes. But anyway, there were kids that did not qualify based on just a point or two. But the ones that did, starting in third grade, they would receive services by a special education teacher such as myself. The problem with the old way was that kids did not receive help, and they were in a cycle of failure for 3 years. And so kindergarten, first, second grade. So these kids had developed problems with self-esteem, some of them with behaviors, some were shut down to learning, they were depressed. It was it just wasn't a very good way to do it. And now, and we're going to get more into differentiated instruction and response to intervention, all those things next week. But now we put so many supports in place right away, and we don't do it that way. And that was a huge switch from when I first started teaching to now. And we will get into a lot of details as far as the ways that we provide supports to kids in future classes and so on. But there have been big changes in special education over the course of my career. If you look in your textbook, they will give you a lot of history on special education law, disability rights, to kind of follow the civil rights movement as far as the time frame go. And you can access and reference all of that in your textbook. You can talk about that in the discussions, but that's kind of a personal story that maybe brings to life a little bit about that transition through the special education law and how those changes took place. Let's watch this video here. It's only about 2 minutes. It's just very basic. It was designed for parents on what is special education. Let's see if we can get this to play okay.
My son Max has lots of energy and no interest in reading. At school, it was becoming a problem. But my sister's a teacher, and she wondered if Max might need some form of special education. And I said, no way. He's perfect. But she said he can be perfect and still have special needs.
Sorry about that. Let's see what we can do. I can bring it up another way here. See if this works. I got my sound turned up. Well, you know, it's for now, because I don't want to spend the time troubleshooting it, I'm going to have you just, you can watch that later. The link for that is in that document right here, okay? Video will be watched in class, which we will not be watching in class. It's right there. So you can take a look at that and on your own time. It's about 2 minutes and just gives you a very brief overview about special education. It's literally 2.5 minutes, something like that. Sorry about that. Well, that's one of those bugs that will get worked out. All right, so we have an alphabet soup of acronyms in special education, and people throw these around like everyone knows what they mean, but they don't. So we're going to briefly go through some of these. First, there's IDEA, sometimes known as IDEIA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a federal law that we all must follow, general education teachers, special ed teachers, everybody. And what this refers to is there is a zero rejection. If you have a disability, you are entitled legally for services for a free, appropriate education. And that looks different for different kids, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. They use Child Find State data collection to find out where these kids are, who they are, and what their needs are so that we can provide services. For all students age 3 through 21, there is, as well as birth to age 2, those kids with developmental delays are also entitled to services. Another term, VRA, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, That refers to legislation that is put into place, VR services. Typically, kids receive these later in high school as they make the transition from high school to the world of work and or college. The Office of Vocational Rehabilitation Act will help them with things like college interviews, possibly help pay for college depending on their situation, books, those kinds of things, provide additional support services. And for those students who are not going to college, they can provide job coaches, interest inventories. They can hook them up with employers to help them become successful in the world of work. FAPE refers to free and appropriate public education for students. LRE is the least restrictive environment, which we will be talking about right now a little more extensively. So LRE, least restrictive environment. What that means is that we want the kids to have the greatest access as much as possible to general education. Does that mean that every student is all day in regular education? It does not, because the nature of special education is that it's individualized, and that is not appropriate for all students. So there are several different options. Number one, they might have part-time special ed. For some kids, they might just receive occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy. Another part-time special education program that many children, many of my students, it's what I do, is in resource room. So for example, what does that look like? They might be pulled out for 1 hour, a half an hour, 30 minutes a day, something like that. In my high school, they are scheduled 1 period a day, typically for resource if they need that. And these are for what we would consider high incidence disabilities. So those would include things like mild learning disabilities, more manageable behavior disorders, kids who can behave well enough to be in the regular classroom most of the day. They don't need a specialized program, schooling, or whatever. So that would be the first option. Second option would be full-time placement in special education classrooms. Some of you in your observations will be placed in a full-time special education classroom. Sometimes these kids can attend elective classes like PE, art, and music with the general population. However, they do spend most of their day because they have a higher level of need. Typically, it's behavioral. If you have a learning disability, you are accommodated by and large in the regular classroom setting with a period or so of resource. But usually if you have higher behavioral needs. If there are no services in a particular school, they might be sent to a special school. You're going to be exploring some links in just a few minutes. There is frequent monitoring of this because if they are sent to a special school or if they do spend their time in a segregated classroom, we are constantly monitoring to see when we can get them back into a lesser restrictive environment. So perhaps they will end up in resource eventually. That will be the goal if possible. Doesn't mean it always can happen depending on the child's needs, but we don't want to say, okay, you're in a regular segregated special education classroom with only kids with other disabilities. You are not in the regular classroom and you are going to stay there for your whole school career. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we're constantly reevaluating to see if they could go to a lesser level of services. Third, higher level is a special school or residential setting. Kids even live there. I know that there is a program in Lincoln called Cedars where kids actually live there for a time. Or there are specialized schools, perhaps for kids with autism or things like that. We'll explore that more in just a few minutes. And finally, there's homebound instruction. So sometimes if kids have health issues such as, I'm thinking of kids who are going through chemotherapy for cancer and, their health, their immune systems are such that they don't want them in the regular classroom setting with other students and exposed to germs and all those kinds of things. They can be on homebound instruction. Typically, a teacher will be sent into their home for a couple hours a day. Or maybe 3 times a week, a couple hours a day, that sort of thing, or expulsion. I mean, some kids, perhaps they brought drugs to school or a knife or something like that, so they'll be expelled for a semester, and we still have to find a way for kids to receive an education. So that's another example of when there would be homebound instruction. This is let me make this a little bit bigger here for you because it's kind of small. So this is a good diagram to kind of illustrate the continuum of least restrictive placement. So at the bottom, this is general education with no direct special ed services or supports. This is your general population. This is the bulk of the kids that you're going to have in your classrooms if you are a general education teacher. A little higher up the triangle, this is general education within the class. Special education services and other related services come into the classroom. So let's say I co-teach math, which I do. So I go into the regular classroom, and so that would be an example of this green bar here. You can see it's a smaller number of students. The bulk of students are at the bottom and the biggest part of the triangle. And the next level would be the kids that are receiving services in the regular classroom. They don't have any pullout whatsoever. These are kids that, you know, as I circulate around the room, we have 2 teachers in the classroom, so we can give them a little bit more support in that classroom. Because we have 2 teachers, we might do some parallel teaching. You'll learn what that means when we study co-teaching, meaning there's 2 groups of you know, we divide the class into 2 small groups, and my co-teacher takes one group, I take the other, so that they have a higher level of intensity of instruction. But their support services take place all in the regular classroom setting. A little higher up the triangle in the yellow bar here, these are pull-out special education services for a small portion of the day. These are the kids that get pulled out for a period of resource. Perhaps they're getting an extra 30 minutes in the elementary school of reading instruction a day, using specialized reading materials, or, you know, one-on-one or small group. Perhaps they're kids who are receiving behavioral support. Maybe, you know, in my school, we call them study skills classes at the high school level, and they get pulled out for 1 period a day, and we'll give them academic, social, and behavior support. We'll help them with homework. If they're having some issues interpersonally with other students, we might do some social behavior mapping. You'll learn what that is down the road. Maybe do a social story or something to help teach them, and so on. In the orange here, this is special classes with mainstreaming opportunities and academic or non-academic classes as specified in the IEP. So these are kids who receive a lot of their education in a segregated, more self-contained classroom, but they will go out for a couple classes during the day. And then up at the very top, these are separate schools, day schools, residential clusters, hospital schools, and homebound. As you can see on the left, it says move this way only as far as necessary. So if we can meet their needs down here, we want to do that. Does that mean we have to put every student down here? No, because we may not be meeting their needs down here. That might not be an appropriate placement. It is a very small number of students that end up here in this red tiny part of the triangle, but if that's what they need, that's what we're supposed to do. And then on the right side here, it says return this way as rapidly and as feasible as possible. We're always checking, we're always evaluating, we're always collecting data. Can we move a child from a residential or day school down into here? Can they be in the regular public school setting, but maybe in a segregated class? And then at some point, could they move down into just pull out for 1 period a day, and eventually down here? So we're always looking for ways to provide kids that least restrictive environment. So now, if you will refer to, well, in just a second, what I want you to do in this document, don't do anything yet, but what I have here are 4 different placement options that I would like you to explore. So the first one is the Bryan Community Focus School. This is a alternative school in Lincoln. BEST, it stands for Burnaclough Educational Solutions Team. This is a, it's not residential, kids don't live there, but it's a separate school for kids who have high behavioral needs and mental health needs. It's out on Saltillo Road out here near Lincoln. The Don D. Sherrill Education Center is another example of an alternative school setting in Lincoln. And then the Omaha Public Schools Programs and Services site shows you all the different kinds of services that a school district would offer, from resource programs, you know, low on that triangle, to very more pull-out classes and pull-out programs at the higher edge of that triangle. So what I'd like you to do now is to go to that document, and the links are right here. So you're going to open those links, and I'm going to have you pause this recording while you do that, but let me finish giving the instructions first. And I'd like you to browse through these sites for maybe 10 to 15 minutes or so, or as long as you like. And then when you finish that, unpause this video and then come on back, okay? All right. So you can go ahead and pause now and open up those links on that document and explore them. All right, everyone, welcome back. We are going to do our activity number 1. On the sheet here, the instructions are, what I'm going to have you do, I'm going to read 8 very small little case studies, and I want you to tell me if you think that based on the student description that I give you, if this student should be in full-time special education inclusion. That means the special education teacher is giving consult only. This student has such a mild disability and is doing so well in the classroom, they don't need resource pullout. They don't even necessarily need co-teaching. All that the special education teacher is going to do is to monitor them, okay? Just check their grades, maybe conference with them once or twice a quarter and so on. They're really pretty much on their own, just being watched to make sure that they're doing okay and don't need any, to move up higher on that triangle. The second option will be part-time special ed resource room. That means they'll be pulled out for 1 period a day to get some help from special education staff. Higher up on the triangle, when I read the student description, do they need full-time placement in a special ed classroom? Do they need special school or residential placement? Or do they need homebound instruction? So if you're listening to this recording and not doing this live, I would like you to, and you can stop and start this recording as you need to, I would like you to number a document 1 through 8 because I'm going to be reading to you 8 student descriptions. And next to each of those numbers, I would like you to take your best guess and type in either full SPED inclusion, which is consult only, part-time SPED resource room, full-time placement in SPED classroom, special school or residential placement, or homebound instruction, whichever you think is the most applicable to that student. And then I would like you to just email that to me. Now, keep in mind, you're not being graded on this. This is just a participation grade. And some of these could go either way. Some kids, maybe it could be resource room, maybe it could be full-time placement, maybe it could be resource room, maybe it could be consult only. So I don't want you to worry if you don't get the exact right one, okay? So here's if you're still a little confused, don't worry. It'll make sense to you. Okay, let me read the first description. Sam is a 10-year-old 4th grader. He has what is considered classic autism. He is nonverbal, cannot read or write, and has been determined by the school psychologist to have a mental age of approximately 3 years old. So type in, and for number 1, he's the first, student description. What do you think would be most appropriate for him? Full SPED inclusion, part-time SPED resource room, full-time placement in SPED classroom, special school or residential placement, or homebound instruction. I'll give you just a minute to think about that. 10 years old, 4th grade, nonverbal, mental age of 3 years old. Classic autism. And you can stop and pause this while you think about it. I'm going to tell you what it could be right afterwards. So if you want to just type on your document what you think. All right, I would say that for Sam, it would probably be a full-time placement in a SPED classroom. Kids like Sam are in the regular public school unless they live in some states that do have special schools for autism, for kids who have more involved autism. I don't know of any in the state of Nebraska, but there are some. I know there's a couple in Colorado. They're usually pretty expensive. Parents with means are able to get their kids in them sometimes. They're very small, but typically these kids are in the regular public school setting, but they're in full-time placement in a special education classroom, okay? So that's number 1. Number 2, Peyton is a 9th grader with Asperger's syndrome, otherwise known as high-functioning autism. His reading and math skills are 2 to 3 years below grade level. He often argues about doing schoolwork, producing approximately 25% of what his peers do. He has poor hygiene and lacks basic social skills. One of his biggest complaints is that he has no friends. When upset, he says that others better be careful or his Jack the Ripper will come out. 9th grader, by the way, these are all real kids. 9th grader, Asperger's syndrome, which is high-functioning autism. His academic skills are 2 to 3 years below grade level. Doesn't like to do schoolwork. Does not have a good network of friends. His social skills aren't the best. And when upset, he can become a little bit threatening. All right. So pause the recording here and then type on your document which of these 5 placements you think it would be, and then come on back and I'll tell you what my thoughts are on that. Okay, for Peyton, He is definitely part-time SPED resource room. His needs would be met in the regular school setting. He was included in regular classrooms, so general education teachers would have him in their classrooms, but I always had an open door policy where he could come down to my room whenever he was upset to process things and so on. And when he needed a quiet place to work and when he was refusing to work in the classroom, he would be sent to the resource room. So he was the middle placement right there. Excuse me, not the middle one, the second one, part-time SPED resource room. Number 3, Cassie's a second grader diagnosed with severe ADHD. Her parents give her medication inconsistently, if at all. She is off task approximately 50% of the time in the classroom and as a result is behind academically. She loses papers and homework never comes back to school. She has difficulty sitting still and keeping her hands to herself. Go ahead and pause this recording on your document. Type up whatever you think is the best placement for Cassie. Second grader, ADHD, off task 50% of the time, behind academically, loses papers, very disorganized, difficulty sitting still and keeping her hands to herself. Pause and then come back. All right, for Cassie, she is another student who would probably be part-time SPED resource room, meaning she would be in the regular classroom setting and her program looked very much like the previous student. 1 or 2 periods a day of resource in the regular classroom with what I call an open door policy to come down to the resource room when she needs individual help. I would work with that classroom teacher as a special education teacher to come up with perhaps take a break cards so that she could leave the classroom and take more breaks as necessary. Brainstorm with the teacher's the general ed teacher ways to provide her more movement in the classroom and so on. And we're going to do a whole unit on each of these disabilities down the road. So you're going to learn many different interventions that you as a regular classroom teacher could use to support a student like Cassie. Number 4, Juan's family escaped a violent life in Guatemala several weeks ago. A 5th grader, Juan and his family speak no English and he never attended school in his poor village. He cannot read or write in his native language. He also appears to have experienced a degree of trauma as he tries to spend a significant portion of his day curled up in a ball under his desk. Go ahead and pause and write down which one you think it would be for him. Juan would be in a full-time placement, not in a special education classroom necessarily, but he would be in a full-time ELL program. It's kind of tricky, and we're going to do a whole class on kids who are ELL but also have disabilities in a little bit. And anyway, so for Juan, it can be very tricky to tell, is it the language that's the barrier, or do they have, for example, a learning disability, and where does the trauma come in? But when these kids come to school, particularly in LPS, Lincoln Public Schools, a larger city school district, they will be in a full-time placement in an ELL classroom. Number 5, Simon is a 1st grader who reads at a 1st grade level and recently completed a pre-algebra course over the summer with a private tutor. He's especially interested in marine biology, has a lab in his home, and spends time developing experiments he finds interesting. His parents are interested in providing him a bilingual education and have hired a Spanish tutor to meet with him twice a week. Go ahead and pause. What placement do you think? All right, so Simon is high ability learner. He will also have an IEP. He would have pull out, I would say, for part of the day, probably part-time resource, because he's going to need some, specialized instruction at an advanced level. But the high ability learner teacher, perhaps even the special ed teacher, would be working with the general education teacher to help them differentiate instruction, provide advanced projects and instruction for that student. Number 6, Tanner, a 7th grader, has experienced trauma most of his young life. He is diagnosed as a student with a behavior disorder. Born in California, he's never met his father. His mother's addicted to drugs and currently in jail. He was sent to Nebraska a year ago to live with one of his mother's former boyfriends he barely knew. The current caregiver is a functioning alcoholic and provides for Tanner's basic needs. Tanner has a history of verbal abuse against both peers and teachers. He was suspended from school for 1 week 2 months ago for coming to school impaired on alcohol, and yesterday was caught selling marijuana on campus after school. When confronted by the school resource officer, Tanner became physically combative. Go ahead and pause. All right, so first of all, for the drugs brought on campus, Tanner is going to be expelled for a semester. So he will be receiving that homebound instruction for the semester. But when he comes back to school, He is a part-time special education resource teacher, a resource room student, which means he will be in the regular classroom. He will be in your classroom with the kind of resource support that I talked about earlier. Number 7, Tyler is a 6th grade student recently diagnosed with leukemia. He is currently undergoing chemotherapy and has a compromised immune system. He's facing 6 months of treatment, including a bone marrow transplant. Go ahead and pause. If you chose homebound instruction for Tyler, you are correct. And the last one, number 8. Maggie was diagnosed with early childhood schizophrenia when she was 5 years old and has been labeled a student with an other health impairment, OHI. She is currently a 6th grader. Although heavily medicated, she still experiences daily auditory and visual hallucinations, which are violent in content. Her medication causes her to sleep approximately 2 to 3 hours each school day, where she has to go to the nurse's office to rest. She is also diagnosed as having dyslexia and reads at a 1st grade level. Go ahead and pause. Write down where you think she belongs. This student would probably be part-time special ed resource room. She was one of my students, and we just don't have full-time self-contained classrooms in my school. It is more of an inclusion school than anything else, but she was in a residential treatment program for a while. Then her behaviors got good enough that she could be in the public school setting. She would spend approximately half the day in the resource room at first, but then she worked her way into going into the regular classroom for most of her day, with a period or 2 in resource. Because of her sleeping, because of the medication was so strong, she did have to spend more time in the resource room than other students would. All right, so let's move on to the IEP. And you watch these videos. The IEP is really like a roadmap for the program for the student. You come together as a team, you determine, you look at the assessment data, you look at what the disability verification is, the team talks about the needs and so on, and then you create this document. You're going to be exploring them in just a minute. You create an IEP, which is the plan for the student. This is a legal document that everyone has to follow. If a teacher refuses to follow an IEP, they can lose their teaching credentials, they can lose their teaching license. We had a student, actually, a teacher, it was for the last student that I read you about, the one with schizophrenia that was heavily medicated. She was a PE teacher, and she had Maggie, the student, in her classroom, and she said, I refuse to take any student in my classroom who cannot run the mile, because in my class, you have to run the mile. Well, the student had accommodations in her IEP where she indeed did not need to run the mile, and the teacher was refusing to follow it. And so it had to go up to administration, who pulled her in and said, if you don't follow this IEP, you will lose your job and you will lose your teaching license. So just an FYI, general education teachers, special education teachers, everybody has to follow the IEP. It's a federal law. The Individuals with Disabilities Act, and no matter what state you teach in, if a student has an IEP, it is considered a legal document to follow. You watched all of these videos in last week's discussion, and so you should have a decent idea of who is on the IEP team, what's included in the IEP, and how an IEP meeting is run. What I would like you to do now is we're going to have an IEP scavenger hunt, I'm calling it that, and every IEP has these things in it. It doesn't matter if it's an IEP in the state of Mississippi, if it's at Lincoln Public Schools, or at my school, Norris, if it's in California. Every IEP has these things in it. It has something that talks about the present levels of performance, which is where is the student at now? What is their reading level? What can they do? What can't they do? Where are they performing now? And then there's another section that is measurable annual goals. So you look at the present levels of performance. So let's say a student is reading 2 years below grade level and has a fluency that's half of what the other students in their grade are. Perhaps they're reading 50 words a minute and we want them to be reading 100 words a minute. That's where the average student is in that class. Your goals would match up with a present level of performance. So you would have a reading goal to increase fluency. All right, but those are 2 sections in the IEP. You will have a section that describes what level of special education and related services they will receive. Remember those 5 things with the 8 students we just did? what level of services? Will it be a residential school? Will it be resource? Will it be self-contained? Will it be homebound instruction? Which one? And then for related services, will they have speech therapy? Will they have occupational therapy? And all those kinds of things. So when I have you looking through these IEPs, I want you to look for those things. There will also be an explanation of the extent to which any the student will not participate with students with disabilities. So every IEP has to put down the amount of time they're with general education students and how much time they're with only special ed students. There will be a section of modifications, accommodations for those students, including on statewide tests. There will be date of services. How often will they receive services? Will they go to the resource room 5 days a week for an hour a day? How long will it last, and where will they go? There will also be a section on how progress towards goals will be measured. Will there be a checklist daily or weekly, a behavioral checklist? Will a quarterly progress report be sent home to parents, and so on? So I'd like you to look for that. What method will be used to inform their parents of their child's progress? Will it be an email? Will it be a something sent in the mail, a report card, whatever? And then if the child is 16 years or older, what will those transition services look like? Who is going to work with that child to help them get into the world of work? Who is going to help them determine what area they would be good at, and what area do they have an interest in, and so on. So if you do look at it, there is an IEP for an older student in there that you'll be looking at. Look for that as well. What I would like you to do, it is on that document. Let me bring it up again. So I'd like you to find those elements, the ones I just talked about. There are 3 links here, sample IEPs 1, 2, and 3. What I'd like you to do is to look through those, and in each of those, find each of these things. And then I'd like you to formulate at least one question you have about IEPs, and I would like you to email that to me, and I will respond to that, okay? And I think that that's it. Let me check for sure. Yeah. So all you need to do is just email me 2 things, your number 1 through 8, and what you put down. It doesn't matter if you didn't get the right guess right away, for those 8 student descriptions on the continuum of placement in least restrictive environment. And also email me at least one question you have about the IEP. And I could be the process, could be the document, could be the legalities of it, your role as a teacher, and I would be happy to answer that. And finally, your assignment for the next class is to read the first half of chapter 2. Make sure you're referencing that in your discussions. Discussion number 2 is due Thursday by midnight. Minimum of 3 responses due Sunday by midnight. Thank you very much, everybody. Feel free to contact me anytime.